Millions of people are taking a new class of medications to lose weight. And by most measures, it's working. The numbers on the scale are going down. The clothes fit differently. The doctor is pleased. But something else is happening, quietly, in the background, that most people aren't being told about clearly enough. The weight they're losing isn't only fat. A significant portion of it is muscle. And for adults over 40, that's not a footnote. That's the part of the story that matters most. This is education, not medical advice. Always work with your doctor before making decisions about medications, exercise, or any aspect of your health care. Now, before anyone thinks this is a video about GLP-1 medications, let me be precise. This is not a video about whether those medications work. They do for many people. And nothing in this video is an argument against them. This is a video about something that was already happening to men over 40 before those medications existed, something that the GLP-1 conversation has made more urgent but didn't create. It's called sarcopenia, and the honest truth is that most men don't think about it until they're already well into it. Sarcopenia is the gradual, progressive loss of muscle mass and muscle function that comes with aging. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show up one morning as a sudden inability to lift something you could lift before. It shows up as needing a little more effort to do what used to feel effortless, taking longer to recover after a hard day, feeling slightly less stable on your feet, noticing that the same workout leaves you more depleted than it used to. Most men interpret these signals as general aging, as getting older, as the inevitable cost of time. And that interpretation is partly right, but it's also incomplete in a way that matters. Because sarcopenia isn't just getting older, it's a specific biological process with a specific timeline, specific warning signs, and specific responses that actually work. The question isn't whether it's happening. For most men over 40, it is. The question is whether you're paying attention early enough to do something about it. Here's what the biology looks like. Starting around age 30, the average person begins losing muscle mass at a rate of roughly 3 to 5% per decade. That rate accelerates after 50. After 60, it can accelerate further. But it's not just about mass, it's about quality. The muscle fibers that tend to go first are the fast-twitch fibers, the ones responsible for power, speed, and explosive movement, the kind that let you catch yourself when you stumble, the kind that make you quick off the mark. Slow-twitch fibers, the ones built for endurance, are more resilient. They hang around longer. Which is why the first thing most men notice isn't, "I've lost muscle," it's something more specific. Recovery takes longer. Explosive movements feel harder. There's a loss of what athletes call pop, the ability to generate force quickly. That's not imagination. That's fast-twitch fiber loss, and it starts earlier than most people expect. A research team at Stanford published work in 2025 that added significant detail to what we understand about why this happens at the cellular level. What they found was that the loss of muscle with aging isn't only about the muscle cells themselves, it's also about the nerve connections that activate those cells. Motor neurons, the nerve fibers that tell muscle fibers to contract, begin to deteriorate with age. When a motor neuron dies, the muscle fibers it was connected to don't simply disappear. They get picked up by neighboring neurons. But those neighboring neurons weren't built to handle the extra load. Over time, the system becomes less precise, less powerful, less reliable. This is part of why the standard advice, just do resistance training, is right, but incomplete. The problem isn't only that men stop exercising, it's that the machinery connecting the nervous system to the muscle is changing in ways that require a specific kind of response. When you think about staying strong after 40, are you thinking about muscle, or are you also thinking about the nerve system that runs it? Let's talk about what GLP-1 medications actually do to muscle, because the mechanism matters. When someone loses weight rapidly, the body doesn't draw only from fat stores. It draws from whatever energy source is most accessible. And muscle tissue, particularly in people who aren't actively training against resistance, is part of that equation. Studies published in 2025 examining body composition changes in GLP-1 users found that somewhere between 15 and 40% of total weight lost on these medications was lean mass, not fat. The range varies depending on the study, the population, and crucially, whether subjects were doing resistance training during the treatment period. That's a wide range, and it's worth being precise about what it means.
It does not mean GLP-1 medications are dangerous or that people should avoid them. The cardiovascular and metabolic benefits for people with obesity are real and well documented. What it means is that weight lost on the scale is not the same thing as fat lost. And for a man over 40 who was already losing muscle before he started the medication, the loss can compound in ways that have real functional consequences. Here's the myth worth correcting directly. Most people, including many physicians, treat weight loss as a straightforwardly good outcome. Less weight equals better health, and in many contexts, that's true. But muscle is metabolically active tissue. It burns calories at rest, it supports insulin sensitivity, it protects joints, it keeps you upright and mobile as you age. It is, in the most practical sense, one of the most important organs in your body for long-term health and independence. When the number on the scale goes down because fat is being lost, that's the goal. When the number goes down partly because muscle is being lost, that's a different story. One that doesn't show up on a standard scale reading, and one that most people aren't tracking. If you've lost weight recently, by any means, do you know how much of that was fat and how much was muscle? And does your doctor? This is where the newer science becomes practically useful, not just interesting. The Stanford research on motor neuron deterioration, combined with what we're learning from GLP-1 studies, points towards a clearer picture of what muscle protection actually requires after 40. It's not complicated, but it is specific. The first element is resistance training, and not the kind most men do casually. The evidence points towards progressive resistance training, workouts that systematically increase load over time, specifically targeting the fast twitch fiber pathways that age fastest. 2 to 3 sessions per week with compound movements that recruit multiple muscle groups simultaneously. This matters on GLP-1 medications because resistance training is the only intervention with consistent evidence for preserving lean mass during caloric deficit. Walking doesn't do it. Cardio alone doesn't do it. Resistance training does. For men over 40 on GLP-1 medications, resistance training is no longer a lifestyle preference. It's the intervention that determines whether the weight you're losing is fat or the muscle you'll spend years trying to rebuild. The second element is protein, and the numbers are higher than most men assume. Current evidence for adults over 50 suggests a target of roughly 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day for muscle preservation, significantly above the standard RDA, which was not designed with sarcopenia prevention in mind. For context, a 180-pound man would be targeting somewhere between 98 and 130 grams of protein per day. Most men eating a typical American diet are getting considerably less than that. The timing of protein intake also appears to matter. Research suggests distributing protein intake across meals rather than concentrating it in one large meal supports muscle protein synthesis more effectively, particularly in older adults. The third element is what the Stanford research points to most directly: neuromuscular activation. Because the problem isn't only muscle atrophy, it's also the degradation of the nerve-muscle connection. And the intervention that most specifically targets that connection is the kind of training that challenges the nervous system as well as the muscle. Explosive movements, balance work,
and exercises that require the neuromuscular system to fire precisely and quickly. This is why older research that focused only on lift-heavy things has been updated. The newer thinking includes velocity, moving with intent and speed, not just with load. None of this is experimental. All of it is available today in any gym with basic equipment and the right programming. What's changed is that we now have a clearer picture of why it works and a clearer sense of urgency around when to start. Here's the timeline that most men don't know and that changes how you think about when to act. Sarcopenia doesn't begin at 60. It doesn't begin at 50. The measurable loss of muscle mass and muscle function begins on average in the mid-30s, slowly at first, imperceptibly for most people. By 45, the process is well underway. By 55, the rate of loss has typically accelerated. By 65, men who have not been actively preserving muscle are often dealing with functional deficits that affect daily life, not just athletic performance. The problem is that the early stages feel like nothing. Not weakness, not pain, not a dramatic loss of capability, just the slow accumulation of small changes that get attributed to everything except what's actually happening. You wake up a little stiffer than you used to, your lower back is a little more sensitive, a weekend of physical activity takes a little longer to recover from.
You feel slightly less sharp in movements that used to be automatic. None of these signals feel like sarcopenia. They feel like Tuesday. There's a specific pattern worth naming because it's more common than most men realize. Many men over 40 maintain a reasonable level of activity. They walk, they golf, they do some recreational sport on weekends. They might even go to the gym occasionally. And they look at themselves in the mirror and think, I'm doing okay. What they're not seeing is the composition change happening beneath the surface. Because body weight can stay roughly stable or even increase slightly while muscle mass is declining and fat mass is increasing. The scale doesn't distinguish between the two, and most men aren't doing the kind of body composition tracking that would reveal the shift. This is what researchers call sarcopenic obesity, a combination of low muscle mass and elevated body fat that can exist at normal or even slightly elevated body weight. It's more common in men over 50 than most people assume, and it carries metabolic and functional risks that neither condition alone would predict. The LGP-1 layer adds a specific wrinkle here. Men who start a GLP-1 medication at 55 or 60 with already declining muscle mass are starting from a compromised baseline. The medication may be medically appropriate, and often is, but the muscle loss risk during treatment is higher than it would be for someone starting from a stronger foundation. This is not an argument against the medication, it's an argument for going in prepared. The men who preserve the most lean mass on GLP-1 treatment in the studies we have are the ones who were doing resistance training before they started, maintained it throughout, and hit adequate protein targets consistently. The difference in lean mass preservation between the trained and untrained groups in these studies is significant, not marginal. Which means the intervention isn't the medication decision. The intervention is what you're doing in the gym and on your plate, before, during, and after. There's also a functional threshold worth understanding. Sarcopenia becomes clinically significant, meaning it starts affecting physical function in measurable ways when muscle mass falls below a certain level relative to body size. Below that threshold, falls become more likely. Recovery from illness becomes slower. Metabolic function declines. Insulin sensitivity worsens. The research suggests that once men fall below that functional threshold, recovery is harder, not impossible, but harder. The neuromuscular connections that have deteriorated don't rebuild as readily as they would have if the process had been interrupted earlier. This is the central argument for early action, not fear, but simple logic. The return on investment for muscle preservation is much higher at 45 than at 65. Not because 65 is too late, it isn't, but because the earlier you interrupt the process, the more of the neuromuscular infrastructure you're working with.
And that infrastructure is what determines how well resistance training actually translates into functional strength. If you knew that the window for high-return muscle preservation was open right now, and that it would get progressively harder to access that return with each passing year, what would you do differently starting this week? Let's also address the signals that should prompt a conversation with a doctor, not panic, but a proper clinical conversation. Unintentional weight loss, particularly if it's happening without dietary changes, deserves attention, not because it's always sarcopenia, but because it warrants investigation. A noticeable and progressive decline in grip strength, which can be measured simply with a hand grip dynamometer available at many clinics, is one of the most reliable early indicators of sarcopenia in research settings. It's not a diagnostic tool on its own, but it's a signal worth bringing up. Difficulty with functional movements that used to be automatic, rising from a chair without using your arms, climbing stairs with discomfort, maintaining balance on uneven ground, these are worth naming to your physician. A DXA scan, dual energy X-ray absorptiometry, is the gold standard for measuring body composition, including lean mass. It's not a standard part of most annual physicals, but for men over 50 who are concerned about muscle loss, it's a conversation worth having. So let's bring this to the ground level. You understand the biology, you understand the timeline, you understand why the GLP-1 era made this conversation more urgent, not because the medications are the problem, but because they've made visible a process that was already underway for most men over 40. Now, the question is, what does a practical, evidence-based response actually look like? Not a supplement stack, not an extreme protocol, the fundamentals applied with the specificity that the current evidence supports.
The first priority is resistance training, and the details matter more than most men realize. 2 to 3 sessions per week is the evidence-based minimum for muscle preservation in adults over 40. Not maintenance-level activity, not occasional heavy lifting, structured, progressive resistance training with the explicit goal of increasing load over time. The movements that matter most are compound, meaning they recruit multiple muscle groups simultaneously. Squats, deadlifts, rows, presses, carries. These movements challenge the neuromuscular system in the way the Stanford research points to as most protective. They require the nervous system to coordinate large amounts of muscle tissue at once, which is exactly the kind of stimulus that slows motor neuron deterioration. Explosive intent matters too. Research on older adults consistently shows that training with the intention of moving quickly, even when the actual movement is slow due to load, preserves fast-twitch fiber function better than slow, controlled movement alone. You don't have to move fast, you have to try to move fast. The neural signal is what matters. The second priority is protein, with specific targets and specific timing. For men over 40, the evidence supports a daily protein intake of 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. For men on GLP-1 medications, where appetite suppression can make adequate intake harder to achieve, hitting the higher end of that range becomes more important, not less. Distributing that intake across 3 to 4 meals per day supports muscle protein synthesis more effectively than concentrating it in 1 or 2 large meals. A rough target of 30 to 40 grams of protein per meal is a practical framework that the current evidence supports. For men on GLP-1 medication specifically, prioritizing protein in smaller meals rather than allowing appetite suppression to reduce overall intake indiscriminately is one of the most important nutritional adjustments the research identifies. The medication reduces appetite. It doesn't distinguish between the calories your body needs and the ones it doesn't. That distinction is your job. The third priority is tracking what actually matters. Body weight is not the right metric for men over 40 managing sarcopenia risk. It's a proxy and an imprecise one. The metrics that matter are lean mass, grip strength,
and functional performance. Lean mass requires a DEXA scan or equivalent. Grip strength can be tested at most clinics and tracked over time. Functional performance, how you move, how you recover, how you feel during and after physical activity, is something you can assess informally but consistently. If you're on a GLP-1 medication, asking your physician to track body composition, not just body weight, is a reasonable and evidence-supported request. Some physicians are already doing this routinely. Many are not. It's worth asking. If your doctor measured your muscle mass today alongside your weight, would you want to know the number? And if the number wasn't what you expected, would it change anything about how you're approaching the next 6 months? A few things worth being clear about before we close. Nothing in this video is an argument against GLP-1 medications for the people for whom they're medically appropriate. The evidence for their cardiovascular and metabolic benefits is real. The decision to use them belongs between you and your physician. What this video argues is that weight loss and muscle preservation are not the same goal, and for men over 40, they require explicit, separate attention. One can happen without the other, and if muscle preservation isn't being actively managed, the default outcome is loss, whether or not you're on medication. The newer research doesn't change the fundamentals. Resistance training, adequate protein, and body composition tracking are not new ideas. What the newer research does is sharpen the picture of why they work, when they matter most, and what happens at the cellular level when they're neglected. That's useful information, not because it should alarm you, but because it gives you a clearer target. The basics work. They have always worked. The science just keeps explaining, with increasing precision, why. As always, everything in this video is for educational purposes only. It is not medical advice. Speak with your doctor before making changes to your exercise routine, diet, or medications, particularly if you are currently using or considering GLP-1 medications. If you want health information that's built on evidence, respects your intelligence, and doesn't oversimplify, subscribe to Golden Thriver. We cover the conversations that matter to men over 40 without the hype and without the shortcuts. And if you're currently on a GLP-1 medication and thinking about muscle preservation, or if you've already started resistance training and want to share what's working, drop it in the comments. That conversation is worth having. We'll see you in the next one.